Thank you. Honourable members, the House is resumed. Kia ora tātou no reira te whare, inga iwi, inga rio, inga hawe wha, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Now, I understand that when the House was last sitting, not too long ago, we were on the third reading of the Copyright Parallel Importing of Films Amendment Bill, and the Honourable Member Claire Curran had the call. And I can inform the Honourable Member that she has 8 minutes and 30 seconds remaining.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
I call the Honourable Member Claire Curran.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Where I was at was making it very clear that Labor's support for this bill is very conditional. Our reasoning was purely around the qualified support for the 5-month delay in parallel importing, which rested on the impact on provincial and rural cinemas. And we've made it very clear that we will not support another go by this industry coming before a select committee to ask for another extension on parallel importing. And I'm very keen to ensure that that is reinforced from the other side of the House as this bill has come out of the Select Committee, Mr Chair. The government, essentially, what lies behind this bill is a much bigger issue, and it's an issue about our copyright regime in New Zealand and an issue of around intellectual property. And unfortunately, this bill could not be considered within the context of that wider discussion as it should have been, because the government has reneged on a commitment to undertake, as it had made, a wide-ranging review of the copyright regime in 2013, and instead has put it on hold. And as we now know, Mr Speaker, the reason for that is because of the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, and that has been revealed and it has been acknowledged by the Minister under questioning. So I want to talk a little bit about that, because where this bill should have sat around parallel importing generally should have been within the context of a wider review. Our concern is, and there's a number of concerns that Labor has around the intellectual property provisions, potentially which are in the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, which as yet we don't know the detail of, because the government has not been transparent about discussing that with other parties and with the public of New Zealand in general. And you don't have to release the text in order to have the discussion. And unfortunately, we aren't able to have the discussion, and all we can do is suppose, based on earlier leaked versions of that text. Our concern, one of our concerns, Mr Speaker, is that there may be being proposed in those negotiations an increased regime of parallel importing generally. And what we want to do is to make sure that that doesn't happen, and that there is a commitment from the other side of the House to back up the discussions and the outcome of the Select Committee process, that that isn't what is being planned. I do want to touch on a few of the other potential things that may be in that copyright regime in the TPP negotiations, and one of them is the potential extension of the duration of copyright by 20 years to 70 years. 70 years, Mr Speaker, yes, that's right, depending on the type of the work and the date that it was published. And it's also been suggested that this could also result in the expansion of the regulatory regime under which internet service providers must assist rights holders in enforcing copyright online, which would pull New Zealand into line with the United States Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which we would see as being a backward step rather than a forward step in terms of promoting innovation in New Zealand. We may also be seeing a new criminal offence for the act of circumventing a technological protection measure or a digital lock, which means that there would be that people would not, who have legitimately bought DVDs in other countries, brought them back to New Zealand and are unable to watch them because they have been locked into that region, are not able to find ways around being able to watch them, which they can do, but there could be strengthened laws in that area which ultimately would be disadvantaging consumers in New Zealand. Another proposal might require New Zealand to afford rights holders an exclusive right over temporary electronic copies, which could mean changing the provisions in our Copyright Act that carve out the liability for transient reproductions of copyright works as part of the normal technological processes. All these issues are very important. They actually do impinge on the ability of artists to go about their work and then, and especially in an online environment, but it also is the impact on innovation and our ability to control our own intellectual property regime, which is extremely important. Our concern is that we are not going to be seeing an aggressive and heavy-handed copyright regime in New Zealand. Mr. Speaker, it's extremely important that we have a balanced and wide-ranging discussion as a community rather than having those things imposed on us, which is why the transparency around the negotiations in the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations are so important, so that the community can be having that discussion, so that there can be discussions in the political environment around what is actually being proposed rather than supposition. This has the potential to harm the way that New Zealand artists and innovative companies work and operate and use the internet to connect with overseas market, because the extension of a copyright duration, internet termination as a penalty, making it illegal to bypass technological protection measures, as I said, so that all of these things, and restricting parallel imports into other areas, so that New Zealanders would both would lose access to many overseas works and be forced to pay more potentially for books, CDs and DVDs than the rest of the world, would actually be a backward step. It would be clearly a backward step for us. The most important thing is for us to be able to have the discussion about it. We believe that excessive copyright durations also could potentially affect libraries from making backups and format shifting works, which could result in a tangible loss of shared heritage. So I think you might see, Mr. Speaker, that while our very qualified support for this bill, which gives an extra 3 years for very limited amount of parallel importing for this particular issue, this has to be the end of it, because we have to be able to move forward. We have to be able to promote innovation and an online environment generally around which is a progressive environment for copyright, and for having that discussion in New Zealand, because if we don't, we are simply going to be going backwards.
I call the honourable member